Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we'll follow Jack and Tu Tien into a breathtaking garden moment where a single kiss becomes their vow, even without a ring, and love feels real enough to silence every doubt. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. The kiss didn't look like a performance. It looked like survival turning into certainty. Under a small wooden arch wrapped in green vines and white blossoms, Jack cupped Tu Tien's face as if he was afraid she might fade if he blinked. Her wedding dress, soft, cloud-like, almost unreal against the misty hydrangeas, trembled at the hem when the breeze slipped through the garden. Mom Ly stood a few steps away with both hands clasped to her chest, tears shining on her cheeks. Vin stayed slightly behind her, not interfering, but watching the garden like a man who understood that peaceful places could still hide sharp edges. Uncle Doong leaned near a bench under the vines, quiet and steady, as if his silence itself was a blessing. There was no ring, no photographer, no crowd to clap, just Jack's hand on Tu Tien's cheek and Tu Tien's fingers gripping his sleeve like a lifeline. "Look at me," Jack whispered. "Not at what we don't have." Tu Tien's eyes were wet, wide with joy and fear tangled together. "People can say anything," she breathed. "They can deny it. They can say it's not real." Jack's thumb brushed away a tear. His voice turned low, unwavering. "Then let them try." And he kissed her slow, gentle, decisive. Not a kiss meant to impress. A kiss meant to seal. The koi pond rippled softly beside them, as if the water itself had witnessed a vow. The string lights shivered under the vines. Mom Ly made a small sound, half sob, half laugh, like her heart had been holding its breath for days. Then, behind the hydrangeas, a phone buzzed once. Sharp. Wrong. Quiet enough to make the skin notice before the mind did. Vin's head lifted immediately. Jack didn't turn around. He only tightened his hold on Tu Tien, shielding her with his body as if the kiss had drawn a line the world was not allowed to cross. And that was the moment Jack realized something. Even if no one could deny what happened, someone still wanted to try. Earlier that morning, Jack had woken up with his heart racing like it had been chased. The room was gray with pre-rain light. His forehead was a warm, stubborn fever that refused to fully leave. But it wasn't only the sickness that made him sit up so fast. It was a dream. Tu Tien in a wedding dress. Beautiful in a way that made the chest ache like moonlight had learned how to breathe. She stood in front of him, smiling softly, and Jack had reached for her hand. Then everything went blank. No guests, no voices, no Mom Ly, no witnesses at all. Just silence, clean and empty, like the world had erased itself on purpose. Downstairs, the smell of black bean porridge pulled him back into reality. Tu Tien moved around the kitchen with quiet focus, her kindness steady enough to make him feel guilty for being sick. "You need to eat," she told him, setting the bowl down carefully. "And don't argue with me today." Jack tried to joke. It came out weak. Tu Tien pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. Her brows pinched instantly. "You're still warm." "I'm better," Jack lied again. She didn't accept it. She reached for the small bottle of oil and warmed it between her palms. "You fainted. I'm not letting you be brave at the wrong time." The word fainted made Mom Ly appear in the doorway, eyes already anxious, hair still messy from a night of not sleeping. "Hospital," she said firmly, as if it wasn't a suggestion. "Both of you." Tu Tien nodded before Jack could protest. "I'll go too." Jack looked at her. "You already had your checkup. I want to be healthy, she answered quietly, as if the sentence was something she'd had to learn. I didn't always have the conditions before. Now, I do. On the drive, the countryside slid past the windows in pale green blurs. The sky hung heavy, threatening rain. Jack's hand stayed tight on the steering wheel, jaw clenched against dizziness. Tu Tien held their IDs in her lap and watched him like she was counting every breath he took. Mom Loie called. Jack kept his voice calm for her sake. We're going to the hospital, just to be safe. Tu Tien is with me. When he hung up, Tu Tien whispered. She didn't sleep. I know, Jack said, and his chest tightened gratitude and guilt in one knot. At the hospital, fluorescent lights flattened everything into sharp reality. Registration counters, waiting chairs, numbers called overhead. Jack asked for the best package without hesitation. Peace of mind, he said, like it was worth any price. Tu Tien went in for her exam first. Jack sat outside, feeling the flu bee dragging him down by the bones, but his eyes stayed fixed on the door. Vin had been texting him about a niche project issue, some meeting, some paperwork, but Jack barely glanced at it. Today wasn't about projects. Today was about keeping what mattered alive. When Tu Tien finally came out, she held her papers like they were fragile treasures. Her expression was disbelieving, lighter, almost stunned. Jack stood up too fast, vision flickering. What did they say? Tu Tien swallowed. Then her voice shook with hope. Better. The doctor said it's improving. Hormones, more balanced. My cycle, steadier. Jack exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. And if I follow the regimen, Tu Tien added, eyes shining, in the future, I may be able to get pregnant naturally. Jack's throat tightened. He reached for her hand immediately with no words, just contact, just proof. His own results came next. Flu B. Rest. Medicine. No pushing through. Even Jack, who could force a deal, force a schedule, force a niche launch, could not negotiate with his body. They left the hospital carrying two different kinds of vulnerability, hers turning into hope, his demanding humility. In the afternoon, Tu Tien insisted on buying him shoes. Jack tried to refuse, then saw her determination, the same determination that had kept her alive through years when love had felt like a luxury. So he let her do it, because sometimes receiving was also a form of trust. When they reached the flower cafe, the garden felt like an answer to a prayer neither of them had dared to say. Hydrangeas in full bloom, koi gliding under the surface like quiet luck, string lights waiting for dusk. Tu Tien smiled really, and Jack felt something inside him loosen. Then Mom Loie arrived. So did Vin. And Uncle Doong. Not a crowd. Just witnesses. Jack guided Tu Tien toward the small arch in the garden, his palms steady around hers. Tu Tien looked down at her empty finger, then up at him with a tremble in her breath. No ring, she whispered, half question, half fear. Jack lifted her hand to his chest, right over his heartbeat. Then feel this, he murmured. If anyone denies us, they're denying what's alive. Behind the hydrangeas, something buzzed again, soft, sharp, wrong. Vin shifted one step, eyes narrowing. And Jack, without letting go of Tu Tien, turned his body slightly to shield her because whatever came next, someone had already seen their vow. Jack kept his arm around Tu Tien's waist as if he could anchor her to the ground. He didn't want her to hear the fear in the air. He wanted her to hear only the steady rhythm of his voice, the warmth of his hand, the truth that was finally beginning to feel real. Vin moved first, subtly, controlled. He didn't rush into the hydrangeas like a hero in a movie. He simply walked the path as if he belonged there, eyes scanning the shadows between flowers, listening for footsteps that didn't match the soft sounds of the garden. Uncle Dung followed at a distance, calm but ready, the way older men are when they've learned trouble doesn't always announce itself. Mom Loy stayed near the arch, clutching her bouquet, trying not to let panic reach her face. But her eyes kept sliding back to Jack and Tu Tien, protective as a mother's prayer. Tu Tien felt Jack's body shift, creating a shield. She whispered, "Someone is here." Jack kissed her forehead fast, quiet, almost invisible to anyone watching. "Even if someone is here," he murmured, "they don't get to touch this moment." Tu Tien's hands curled into his suit jacket. They can still talk. They can still deny it. Jack's gaze stayed on hers, steady enough to calm the shaking in her chest. "Let them talk," he said. "They can't rewrite what you and I just chose." A breeze lifted the edge of her veil. For a second, it brushed across Jack's cheek like a soft reminder of the dream he'd woken from white fabric, silence, the fear of being erased. He couldn't let that happen in real life. Vin returned with the smallest shake of his head. Nothing obvious. No stranger standing there now. No phone left behind. Just flowers and empty air, like the garden was pretending it had never buzzed at all. That was the part that made Jack's stomach tighten. Because danger that hides is always more patient than danger that attacks. Uncle Dung stepped back beside them, voice low. Could be someone's phone. Could be nothing. Jack nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. Or it could be a test. Tu Tien flinched at the word. Jack immediately turned his tone gentler. "Not you," he said, quickly. "Not us. Our boundaries." He reached for her hand again, ringless, warm, undeniable. He lifted it between them as if it was something sacred. "Today isn't about proving anything to outsiders," he said. "It's about you believing me when I say you're not temporary." Tu Tien tried to breathe. Her lips trembled. "I want to believe that." Jack leaned closer, so only she could hear. "Then start here," he whispered. "This kiss, it wasn't for them. It was for the part of you that thinks you don't deserve real love." Tu Tien's eyes filled again, slower this time, like the tears were no longer panic, more like release. Mom Loy stepped forward carefully, voice shaking with emotion. "People can deny it if they want," she said. "But I saw it. I'm here. I will say it out loud for you." Tu Tien's shoulders dropped, like a tight knot in her chest finally loosened. Vin exhaled, then pulled out his phone not to photograph, but to check the signal. His brows knitted. "This area has weak reception," he said quietly, mostly to Jack. "But that buzz, it happened right behind the hydrangeas. If someone was here, they were close." Jack's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes warm on Tu Tien. "We'll leave soon," he promised softly. "Not because we're scared, because we're smart." Tu Tien nodded, then looked up at him with a fragile courage. "If we leave, does it mean the wedding ends?" Jack's expression softened into something tender and fierce at once. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles slowly, reverent, like sealing ink. "This isn't a place," he said. "It's a decision." Then he pulled her into his arms, and this time the kiss lasted a little longer. Gentle, steady, certain, while the garden lights trembled under the vines and the koi pond rippled like quiet applause. When they finally parted, Tu Tien's eyes were still wet, but her gaze was stronger. Jack turned slightly, guiding her back toward Mom Loy and Uncle Dung, keeping her close. Vin stayed a step behind them like a shadow that protected rather than followed. And as they walked away from the arch, Jack felt it again, something in the air, like a gaze withdrawing. A moment later, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. One missed call. No message. Jack's thumb hovered over the screen, then locked it without answering. He slipped the phone into his pocket, tightened his hold on Tutien's hand, and said quietly, more vow than words, "Let them deny it." He glanced at her, eyes steady. "We'll keep making it real."
Hello everyone, in this episode, Jack wakes from haunting dream of Tutien in a wedding dress, beauty yet unreal, no guests, no photos, and as if their marriage were erased, still recovering from illness. He insists on hospital checkup for peace of mind, and Tutien goes to, determined to protect her health after years of hardship. At the hospital, Tutien receives encouraging news, and her hormones are improving, her cycle is steadier, and with continued treatment she may be conceived naturally in the future. Jack learns he has flu B and rest. Later, Tutien buys him shoes as a small act of love. They celebrate quietly at a flower cafe. There, they hold hands and share a ringless vow while Jack senses they make me watch. Thank you for watching this episode.